August 30th, 1945. Yokohama, Japan. The smell of ash still hanging in the air 15 days after surrender. I hear the trucks before I see them. American engines, different from our military vehicles, louder and steadier. My hands shake holding the corner of my husband's funeral shroud. I'm Akiko Tanaka, 26 years old, widow for 3 weeks, mother of one who will grow up never knowing his father. Today, the enemy arrives to occupy our city. The radio says we must cooperate, must not resist. But how do I bow to the men whose bombs killed my husband? How do I smile at the faces of those who destroyed everything? If you want to know how the impossible became possible, how enemies became something else entirely, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like and drop a comment telling me, could you forgive the unforgivable? Let's go. I never planned to hate Americans. I planned to teach Ikebana, raise my children in the house where my mother was born, and grow old watching cherry blossoms mark the seasons. War made other plans. When the war started in December 1941, I was 22, married to Hiroshi for 1 year. Our son Kenji was 3 months old. The neighborhood celebrated Pearl Harbor like a festival. Finally, Japan would show the world our strength, our superiority, our divine purpose. I didn't celebrate. I looked at my infant son and felt only dread. Hiroshi worked at the Yokohama shipyards, essential war work, building destroyers, and repair ships for the Imperial Navy. He left before dawn, returned after dark, came home exhausted and covered in metal shavings. "We're building the ships that will win the war," he'd say with pride. I'd nod and say nothing. What could I say? That I feared every ship he built? That I dreamed of American bombs falling on the very yards where he worked? That I wanted Japan to lose if it meant my husband would live? You couldn't say such things. Not in 1942. Not when the military police arrested people for less. Not when neighbors reported neighbors for defeatist talk. So I stayed silent. Raised Kenji. Practiced my flower arrangements. Pretended everything was fine while the war swallowed more and more of our lives. The ration started in 1942. Rice reduced to barely enough, then vegetables, then fish, then everything. By 1944, we were eating sweet potato vines and acorn flour. Kenji cried from hunger every night. I had no milk left to give him. The contrast was grotesque. Military officers still ate well. I saw them in restaurants that ordinary people couldn't enter. The generals had rice and meat while our children starved. But we were told this was sacrifice for the emperor, for Japan, for victory. I believed it because I had to, because the alternative was madness. The bombing started in November 1944. B-29 superfortresses. We called them Bisan, making them almost friendly, almost familiar. But there was nothing friendly about what they did. The first raid on Yokohama killed 570 people. The shipyards were damaged but not destroyed. Hiroshi came home with burns on his arms from fighting fires. "They're trying to stop us from building ships," he said, while I bandaged his wounds. "But they won't. We'll rebuild. We'll win." I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him see that we weren't winning anything, that every B-29 that appeared in our skies was proof we'd already lost. But I stayed silent. That's what good Japanese wives did. We stayed silent. May 29th, 1945. The big raid. The one that changed everything. The air raid sirens wailed at 9:30 a.m. We'd grown almost casual about them. Grab Kenji, run to the shelter, wait it out, go home. Routine. Deadly routine. But this raid was different. 454 B-29s. More than we'd ever seen. They came in waves, dropping incendiary bombs that turned entire neighborhoods into firestorms. Hiroshi was at the shipyards. I was home with Kenji and my mother-in-law. We made it to the neighborhood shelter, a reinforced basement under the school. 60 people crammed into a space meant for 30. The bombing lasted 3 hours. The building above us shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Someone's child wouldn't stop screaming. The air got hotter and thinner until breathing felt like swallowing fire. When we emerged, Yokohama was burning, entire blocks gone. The school above our shelter was a skeleton of beams and ash, bodies in the street. I won't describe them. Some things you can't unsee. Our house was damaged but standing. The roof partly collapsed, windows blown out, but we had walls. We had something. The shipyards were hit hard. Direct strikes on 3 dry docks. Buildings collapsed. Fires everywhere. I stood in our ruined doorway and watched the smoke rise from where Hiroshi worked. He came home at midnight, covered in soot and blood. Not his own. His hands were shaking. 73 men dead, he said. 73. I knew all of them. Yamamoto-san, who brought his lunch to share. Sato-san, who sang while he welded. All dead. I held him while he cried. My proud husband who believed in victory, broken by the reality of what war actually was. We're losing, he whispered. We've already lost. But they won't admit it. They'll make us fight until everyone is dead. I should have reported him. Those words were treason, defeatism, punishable by arrest or worse. Instead, I held him tighter. Then we survive, however we can. For Kenji, he agreed. But surviving got harder every day. By June, we were eating grass. Actual grass from the park, boiled into soup. Kenji's ribs showed. My mother-in-law stopped eating so we could give her portion to the boy. The raids continued. June 10th, June 29th, July 17th. Each time, more of Yokohama burned. More neighbors died. More children were orphaned. Our military kept promising victory, kept saying American invasion would be crushed, kept talking about Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit that would overcome American material strength. But I saw the B-29s. I counted them, hundreds at a time, unopposed. Our fighters couldn't stop them. Our anti-aircraft guns barely touched them. They flew over like they owned our skies. Because they did. August 6th. The radio said Hiroshima was destroyed by a special bomb. They didn't explain what that meant. Just that an entire city was gone. August 9th. Same thing in Nagasaki. August 15th. The Emperor spoke on the radio, his voice high and strange, speaking in formal court language most people barely understood. But the meaning was clear. Japan surrendered. The war was over. We'd lost. Some neighbors cried. Some seemed relieved. Most just sat in stunned silence, trying to understand what came next. Hiroshi came home from the shipyards with news. They're dismantling everything. The Americans will occupy. They'll control everything. Military, government, everything. What happens to us? I don't know. They say the Americans will treat us fairly. But they also said we'd win the war. I don't know what to believe anymore. August 22nd. Hiroshi went to work as usual. The shipyards were being converted. No more warships, just salvage and cleanup. He was measuring damage to a dry dock when the structure collapsed. 3 men were killed instantly. Hiroshi was trapped under steel beams. It took 2 hours to dig him out. He was still alive when they brought him home on a stretcher. Barely. Internal injuries too severe to treat. We had no hospitals. They'd all been bombed. No doctors. They were all with the military. No medicine. We'd had none for months. I held his hand while he died. It took 6 hours. He was in terrible pain. He kept apologizing. I'm sorry, Akiko. Sorry I couldn't protect you. Sorry I believed the lies. Sorry I'm leaving you alone. You're not leaving. I lied. You'll recover. You'll see Kenji grow up. He smiled. He knew I was lying. Tell Kenji his father tried. Tell him I loved him. Tell him to be smarter than me. To question. To think. To not believe everything he's told. Those were his last words. To not believe everything he's told. He died at sunrise on August 23rd. 28 years old. Killed by the war even after the war ended. I had no money for a proper funeral. No family to help. They were all dead or displaced. Just me and my mother-in-law and a 4-year-old boy who kept asking when Papa was coming home. We wrapped Hiroshi in a white cloth, the only clean thing I had left. Carried him to the neighborhood temple. But the temple was damaged. The priest gone. There was nowhere to conduct proper rites. We laid him in our ruined garden. My mother-in-law chanted sutras from memory. Kenji picked flowers. Weeds, really. But he thought they were flowers. I just knelt there, numb, wondering how we'd bury him without help. That's when the Americans arrived. August 30th, 1945. 7 days after Hiroshi died, his body was still in our garden, wrapped in cloth, waiting for burial I couldn't provide. The first American vehicles rolled into our neighborhood at noon. Jeeps and trucks with white stars painted on the sides. Soldiers in different uniforms than I'd seen in propaganda. Not monsters, just men, looking cautious and young. Neighbors hid, pulled their daughters inside. The propaganda had told us what American soldiers would do to Japanese women. Rape, murder, torture. We'd been taught to fear them more than death. I couldn't hide. Hiroshi was in my garden. I had to protect his body, at least. That much I could do. 2 soldiers approached my gate. Both young, early 20s maybe. One was tall with red hair. The other shorter, darker, with sergeant stripes on his helmet. They saw Hiroshi's body, stopped, spoke to each other in English I couldn't understand. The sergeant pointed at me, said something. The other soldier nodded. They came through the gate. I stood between them and Hiroshi, ready to fight. I had nothing to fight with, but I'd try anyway. The sergeant held up his hands. Empty. Non-threatening. He said something in English, then tried basic Japanese. Daijobu? Daijobu. It's okay. It's okay. I didn't believe him. How could it be okay? My husband was dead. My city was destroyed. The enemy was in my garden. He pointed at Hiroshi, then at me, then made a digging motion, then pointed at himself and the other soldier. I didn't understand. He tried again, more clearly, pointed at Hiroshi, then at the ground. Digging motion, then tapped his own chest and his partner's. They wanted to help bury my husband. I stared. The enemy, the people who dropped the bombs that destroyed our city, the soldiers we'd been taught to hate and fear. They wanted to help bury the man their war had killed. It made no sense. The sergeant said something else. The other soldier left and returned with 2 more men and shovels. 4 American soldiers standing in my ruined garden, asking permission to bury my husband. I looked at my mother-in-law. She was crying. She nodded. Hi. I whispered. Yes. They bowed. Actually bowed. Respectfully. Like they understood what this meant. Then they started digging. They dug for 2 hours in the August heat. Proper depth. Proper dimensions. They worked seriously, silently, like this mattered. Like Hiroshi's burial mattered. When the grave was ready, the sergeant approached me again, made a gesture. Should they move the body? I nodded. 4 of them lifted Hiroshi gently, carefully, treating him with dignity. They lowered him into the grave and stepped back, removing their helmets. The sergeant looked at me, waiting. My mother-in-law began chanting sutras. I joined her, voice breaking. Kenji stood between us, confused and crying. The American soldiers stood at attention, heads bowed, respectful, silent. When we finished, the sergeant said something. The soldiers began filling the grave, taking turns with the shovels, making sure it was done properly. When they finished, one soldier placed a small wooden cross at the head. Another placed wildflowers they'd picked somewhere. They bowed again. Deep, respectful bows. Then they left without asking anything, without demanding anything, without doing any of the terrible things we'd been taught Americans would do. They just helped, because they saw someone who needed help. I collapsed, just fell to my knees beside Hiroshi's grave. Everything I'd held together for 7 days. The grief, the fear, the exhaustion, the impossibility of everything. It all came out at once. I cried like I hadn't cried since childhood. Loud, ugly, broken crying. My mother-in-law held me. Kenji held me. We cried together in our ruined garden while American vehicles drove past on the street. The enemy had buried my husband. The people we'd been taught to hate had shown us more kindness than our own government had in 4 years. I didn't understand. Couldn't understand. How were these the monsters from the propaganda? How were these the demons we'd been told would destroy us? They were just men. Young men who saw a dead body and a grieving family and decided to help. That night, I wrote in my diary, the one I'd kept hidden through the war. Today, I buried my husband with help from American soldiers. The same Americans whose bombs killed him. The same Americans we were taught to hate. But they weren't hateful. They were kind. They were respectful. They treated Hiroshi's death as something that mattered. I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything I was told was wrong. The Americans aren't monsters. The war wasn't glorious. Victory wasn't worth this price. Hiroshi was right with his last words. Don't believe everything you're told. Question. Think. I'm starting to think now. And what I'm thinking is that we were the ones who were wrong. Not about everything, but about enough that 2.5 million of us died for lies. I'm angry. At the military that fed us propaganda. At the government that let our children starve while officers ate well. At everyone who told us this war was divine and just and winnable. But I'm also grateful to 4 American soldiers whose names I don't know, who didn't have to help, who could have walked past, who chose kindness instead. I don't know what comes next, but I know this. If the enemy can be kind, maybe everything is different than I thought. Maybe there's hope after all. Maybe we can rebuild into something better than what we were. Maybe that's what Hiroshi would have wanted. To not believe the old lies. To build something new. I'll try. For him, for Kenji, for all of us who survived when we shouldn't have. The next morning, the sergeant returned, with more soldiers. And supplies. They came to every house in the neighborhood, distributed food, rice, flour, canned goods, real food. More than we'd seen in years. They brought medicine, bandages, water purification tablets, soap. They brought carpenters to assess structural damage, engineers to check water lines, doctors to treat the sick and wounded. They brought order to chaos, hope to despair, kindness where we expected cruelty. The sergeant found me outside my house. He held out a bag. Inside, rice, dried fish, powdered milk for Kenji, chocolate bars, and clean cloth for bandages. For you, he said in broken Japanese. For boy, for grandmother. I took the bag, bowed deeply. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you very much. He smiled. You're welcome, ma'am. We're sorry for your loss. Sorry for everything. Sorry. The enemy was apologizing. For killing my husband. For destroying my city. For the war. Our own government had never apologized. Never acknowledged the suffering. Just demanded more sacrifice for victory that never came. But these Americans, these occupiers, these conquerors, they said sorry. I didn't know what to do with that. Over the following days, more Americans arrived. The occupation was beginning in earnest. Military government, new rules, new systems. The Americans were taking control of everything. But they weren't brutal. They weren't cruel. They were organized and efficient and surprisingly respectful. They set up distribution centers for food and supplies, medical clinics staffed by army doctors, employment offices to help people find work, housing assistance for families displaced by bombing. They hired Japanese civilians as translators, administrators, laborers, paid real wages, treated workers fairly. The contrast with our own military was stunning. The Imperial Army had taken everything and given nothing. The American Army was giving everything and taking little in return. Why? I asked one of the interpreters, a Japanese woman who'd studied English before the war. Why are they helping us? I asked. We were their enemy. We killed their soldiers. Why aren't they punishing us? She smiled sadly. They say it's because they want to win the peace. That destroying your enemy doesn't win anything if you don't help them rebuild afterward. They learned from the last war. The last war? World War I. After that war, the winners punished Germany so harshly that Germany wanted revenge. Created conditions for Hitler. For this war. The Americans don't want to make that mistake again. They want to help Japan rebuild so we become friends, not enemies again. Friends. With the people who killed my husband. The idea was absurd. But then I remembered those 4 soldiers digging Hiroshi's grave, bowing respectfully, placing flowers, showing dignity to a dead enemy. Maybe friendship was possible. Maybe the impossible was happening. In September, the Americans organized neighborhood councils, local representatives to communicate between occupation forces and civilians. They asked me to serve. Why me? I asked the sergeant who'd helped bury Hiroshi. I'd learned his name was Sergeant Thompson, from Kansas. Because you speak some English, he said through the interpreter. Because you lost your husband, but you're still here, still fighting. Because people respect you. I don't speak English well. You'll learn. We'll teach you. So I became a liaison. A bridge between the occupiers and the occupied. Between past enemies learning to coexist. It was strange. Surreal. 3 weeks ago, we'd been at war. Now I was sitting in meetings with American officers, discussing rice distribution and rubble cleanup and school rebuilding. They listened to what we needed. Actually listened. Made notes. Followed up. When I said the water in our neighborhood was contaminated, engineers came and fixed it. When I said children needed school supplies, boxes of pencils and paper arrived. When I said families needed fuel for winter, they arranged deliveries. They weren't perfect. There were incidents. Soldiers who stole, who were rude, who looked at Japanese women the wrong way, but the military police dealt with them swiftly. Americans who broke rules faced punishment. It was more justice than we'd ever gotten from our own military. By October, something impossible was happening. I was starting to trust them. Not completely, not without reservation, but enough to believe we might actually survive this. Kenji started attending the reopened school. American military government provided supplies. Japanese teachers taught. A hybrid system emerging from the ruins. My mother-in-law started helping at the neighborhood distribution center, organizing food deliveries, checking on elderly neighbors, finding purpose after loss, and I learned English. Studied every night after Kenji went to bed. Sergeant Thompson gave me a primer and patiently corrected my pronunciation. "Why are you helping me?" I asked him once. In English, hesitant and broken. "Because you're helping us," he said simply. "Because this occupation only works if we work together. Because my job is to win the peace, not just the war. Your job is to occupy. Our job is to help Japan rebuild. To make sure this never happens again. To turn enemies into friends. Is that possible?" He smiled. "You're sitting here talking to me in English. Your son plays baseball with American kids from the base. Your mother-in-law took cookies to our mess hall yesterday. I'd say it's already happening." He was right. Impossibly, absurdly, against everything we'd been taught and everything we'd experienced. Friendship was growing in the ruins of war. It wasn't easy. There was resentment, pain, grief that would never fully heal. Every time I saw an American soldier, some part of me remembered those B-29s, remembered Hiroshi dying, remembered everything we'd lost. But I also remembered 4 soldiers digging a grave, remembered sorry, remembered kindness when cruelty would have been easier. And slowly, so slowly, I started to believe that maybe Hiroshi's last words were right, that we needed to question everything, to not believe the old lies, to build something new. Maybe that's what the Americans were offering, a chance to build something new from the ashes of everything that failed. In November, they dedicated a memorial stone in the neighborhood park, listing everyone who died in the May 29th bombing. Hiroshi's name was there. 847 names total. All our neighbors, all our friends. Sergeant Thompson attended the ceremony, with 20 other American soldiers. They stood at attention while we chanted sutras. They bowed respectfully. They acknowledged the dead, our enemy, honoring our dead, because they understood that those deaths mattered, that our grief was real, that healing required acknowledging what was lost. After the ceremony, an old man approached me, Mr. Yamada, who'd lost his entire family in the bombing. "Tanaka-san, is it wrong to stop hating them?" he asked quietly. "The Americans, is it wrong to appreciate their help? To feel grateful? Does that dishonor the dead?" I thought about Hiroshi, about his last words, about those 4 soldiers, and that grave. "I think the dead want us to live," I said slowly, "to rebuild, to be smarter than we were, to not repeat the mistakes. If the Americans help us do that, if they help us create a Japan where no more sons die for lies, then maybe that's how we honor the dead, by building something better." "You really believe that?" "I'm starting to. I don't know if I'm right, but I know that hate won't bring them back, and kindness from unexpected places might be our only path forward." He nodded, wiped his eyes. "My grandson plays with American children, comes home teaching me English words, laughing, actually laughing. I haven't heard him laugh since before the war. Maybe that's worth something. Maybe it's worth everything. That night, I wrote in my diary, 5 months ago, I would have died rather than accept help from Americans. Now I'm teaching their children Japanese words while they teach me English. Now I'm organizing meetings with their officers. Now I'm watching Kenji play with their sons. Hiroshi would be confused, or maybe he'd understand. He was changing before he died, starting to question, starting to see through the propaganda. I think he'd want this. Want us to rebuild. Want Kenji to grow up in a Japan that doesn't lie to its children about divine missions and inevitable victory. The Americans aren't perfect, but they're treating us better than our own leaders did. They're helping when they could be punishing. They're showing kindness when cruelty would be easier. Maybe that's the lesson from all this horror. That how you treat the defeated defines who you really are. That power without mercy is just tyranny. That winning without helping others rebuild is just creating future enemies. I'm grateful, impossibly, absurdly grateful, for 4 soldiers who dug a grave, for rice and medicine and hope when we had nothing, for the chance to build something new from ruins. Is it forgiveness? I don't know. Can you forgive the people whose bombs killed your husband? Maybe. Eventually. With time. But I can be grateful. I can cooperate. I can work toward a future where Kenji doesn't have to survive what I survived. Maybe that's enough to start with. December 1945. Yokohama, Japan. The sound of hammers and saws. Construction everywhere. American engineers teaching Japanese carpenters new techniques. The city rising from ash like something impossible becoming real. I'm standing outside the new community center, built in 6 weeks with American materials and Japanese labor. Inside, Kenji is learning English from a soldier from California who teaches like he actually cares. It's been 4 months since Hiroshi died. 4 months since I watched American soldiers bury my husband with more respect than our own military ever showed. Today, Kenji asked me if it's okay to like Americans. I told him yes. I hope I'm right. Winter brought challenges nobody expected. Not fighting. The war was over. But survival. Japan's infrastructure was destroyed. Food production devastated. Millions of displaced people returning from overseas. The country was on the edge of starvation. The Americans responded with Operation Garrioa, government and relief in occupied areas. Massive food shipments, rice from California, wheat from Kansas, powdered milk, canned goods. Millions of tons of food to prevent mass starvation. Our old government had let us starve while fighting. The occupying government was feeding us. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I worked at the distribution center 6 days a week, organizing deliveries, checking inventories, making sure supplies reached families who needed them most. Sergeant Thompson supervised, but he let me run most operations. You understand your people better than I do, he said. I'm just here to make sure you have what you need. One morning in January 1946, an old woman came to the center, Mrs. Kawasaki from 3 streets over. She'd lost 2 sons in the war. Her husband died in the May bombing. She was alone and starving. I need rice, she said quietly. Ashamed to be begging. Please, just a little. I checked the registry. She'd already received her weekly ration. There were rules, limits, systems, but she was starving. I could see it in her face. I looked at Sergeant Thompson. He'd overheard. How much does she need? He asked. 2 kilos would last her another week. Give her 5. And add extra dried fish. But the regulations? I'll handle the regulations. Feed her. I gave Mrs. Kawasaki 5 kilos of rice, dried fish, and tea. She cried. Actually cried from gratitude. The Americans are very kind, she whispered. Kinder than we deserve. Everyone deserves kindness, I told her. Especially now. After she left, I asked Sergeant Thompson, won't you get in trouble for breaking the rules? Maybe. But she's a 70-year-old widow who lost everything. If I get in trouble for feeding her, then the rules are wrong. This happened constantly. Americans bending rules to help people, sharing their own rations, giving away personal supplies, acting like Japanese suffering mattered as much as American success. Why? I asked Thompson once, late afternoon in February. We were inventorying supplies in the warehouse. Why do you care? I asked in my improving English. We were your enemy. We killed your soldiers. Why do you help us? He stopped counting boxes, thought about it. My grandfather fought in France in World War I, he said slowly. He told me stories about how the winners punished Germany so hard that Germany wanted revenge, how that revenge led to Hitler, to this war, to millions dead. He sat on a rice sack. The generals learned from that. They said, "We can't just defeat Japan. We have to help Japan rebuild. Make you allies instead of enemies. Break the cycle." So this is strategy? Politics? It started that way. But then you meet people, see kids who are hungry, see widows like you who lost everything but keep going, and it stops being strategy. It becomes just doing what's right, helping people who need help. Even enemies? You're not enemies anymore. You're just people trying to survive, same as us. I thought about that a lot. About how enemies became people. About how winning meant helping, not punishing. About how the impossible was happening every day. In March, they opened schools across Yokohama. American military government provided buildings, supplies, curriculum guidance, but Japanese teachers taught. Japanese administrators ran operations, a partnership emerging from occupation. Kenji started first grade. He came home excited every day. "Mama, I learned English numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Very good. And Sergeant Miller taught us baseball. It's like Yaku but different. Did you have fun? So much fun. Can we play baseball at home? Baseball. The American sport. My son was learning American culture, speaking American words, playing American games. Should I stop him, preserve Japanese traditions, resist the occupation's cultural influence? But Kenji was happy. For the first time since Hiroshi died, my son was genuinely happy. Laughing, playing, being a child instead of a war survivor. How could I take that away from him? My mother-in-law noticed my conflict. "You're worried about him becoming too American," she said one evening. "Aren't you?" I was. But then I remembered. We raised him in a Japan that lied to him. That would have sent him to die in a pointless war like his father. Maybe becoming a little bit American isn't the worst thing. Hiroshi wanted him to be Japanese. Hiroshi wanted him to be alive, to think for himself, to not believe lies. If the Americans teach him that, then they're honoring Hiroshi's last wishes better than we could. She was right. Hiroshi's final words: "Don't believe everything you're told. Question. Think." Maybe that was more important than preserving culture that had failed us. In April, they organized community meetings about Japan's new constitution. The Americans were writing it with Japanese input. Democracy, human rights, women's suffrage. Concepts we'd never had. I attended as a neighborhood representative. The meetings were contentious. Older Japanese men angry about losing traditional power structures. Younger people excited about change. Everyone uncertain about the future. One evening, an old man stood up. Mr. Ishida, a former Imperial Army officer. He'd lost an arm in Burma. "This constitution makes Japan weak," he declared. "No military, no emperor worship, no hierarchy. This isn't Japan anymore." An American officer responded, Captain Bennett from the Civil Affairs section. He spoke through an interpreter, but his voice was firm. "The old Japan is gone. It died in the war it started. This constitution ensures the new Japan never makes those mistakes again, never sends soldiers to die for lies, never starves children for empire, never becomes the aggressor. You're destroying our culture. We're destroying militarism. Culture is tea ceremonies and poetry and art. Those stay. What goes is the system that convinced millions to die for a war you couldn't win." The room fell silent. "You didn't talk about the war that way. Didn't acknowledge we'd been wrong. Didn't admit the divine mission was a lie, but everyone was thinking it. I could see it in their faces. Finally, I stood up. My hands were shaking, but I spoke anyway. My husband died building ships for the Imperial Navy. He believed we'd win. He believed the propaganda. He died for nothing because we were lied to. If this new constitution prevents that from happening again, if it saves other women from becoming widows for lies, then I support it. Completely." Other women stood, one by one. Widows, mothers who'd lost sons, women who'd suffered while men made decisions. "I support it. I support it too. My sons died for nothing. Never again." The old men looked shocked. Japanese women didn't speak out like this. Didn't challenge. Didn't demand voices. But the war had changed us. Suffering had changed us, and the Americans were giving us power we'd never had. Captain Bennett smiled. The Constitution includes women's suffrage. You'll be able to vote, to choose your leaders, to ensure they serve you instead of leading you into wars. Women voting, choosing leaders, having power. The concept was revolutionary, and I wanted it. Desperately wanted it. May brought cherry blossoms. First spring after the war. The trees had survived bombing and fire. They bloomed like nothing had happened, like the world could still be beautiful. Sergeant Thompson found me sitting under the trees near Hiroshi's grave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Please." We sat in silence for a while, watching petals fall. A moment of peace in a world still rebuilding. "I'm rotating home next month," he said finally. "Back to Kansas. They're replacing me with Lieutenant Morrison." My chest tightened. Thompson had become a friend, the first American I'd really trusted. Losing him felt like another loss. "I'll miss you," I said. "You helped us so much. You helped yourself. I just provided supplies. You did the hard work. You did more than that. You showed us Americans aren't monsters, that former enemies can be friends. That's worth more than rice." He smiled. "I learned as much from you. About resilience, about forgiveness, about rebuilding after everything falls apart. What will you do in Kansas?" "Go back to teaching, high school history. I'll tell my students about Japan, about the occupation, about how we won by helping instead of punishing. Will they believe you?" "Some will, and those who don't. I'll bring them back here someday, show them what we built together, proof that the cycle can be broken." Before he left, he gave me something. A photograph. 4 American soldiers standing in my garden. The day they buried Hiroshi. I didn't know anyone had taken a picture. "So you remember," he said. "So Kenji knows. So the story doesn't get lost." I looked at the photo. 4 young Americans, shovels in hand, standing respectfully beside a grave. Enemies showing mercy. "I won't forget," I promised. "None of us will." Thompson left in June. I cried. So did my mother-in-law. So did dozens of other people he'd helped. An enemy who'd become a friend. A conqueror who'd become a partner. Lieutenant Morrison was different. Younger, more formal, less patient. But he tried. He listened. He helped. The system Thompson had built continued. Summer 1946 brought new challenges. Food shortages eased, but housing remained critical. Millions still displaced. Families living in ruins or makeshift shelters. The Americans launched reconstruction programs. Hired Japanese workers. Paid real wages. Built housing developments using new techniques. Faster, cheaper, more efficient than traditional methods. I was hired as a housing coordinator, matching families with available units, managing applications, ensuring fair distribution. The work was exhausting. 12-hour days, endless paperwork, desperate families begging for homes, not enough units for everyone who needed them. But it was purpose. It was rebuilding. It was creating something from nothing. One day in August, exactly 1 year after the surrender, a family arrived at my office. The Saito family. Father, mother, 3 children. They'd been living in Manchuria when the war ended. Spent a year getting back to Japan. Lost everything. "We have nothing," Mr. Saito said. "No house, no money, no family here. Please, we just need a place to sleep." I checked the registry. No available units, everything allocated. But I looked at those 3 children. Thin, exhausted, traumatized from a year of displacement. I thought about Kenji. About what it meant to have a home. About how the Americans had bent rules to help us. "I have something," I said. "It's not ideal. Small, damaged. But it has walls and a roof. We'll take it. Anything." I gave them Unit 47 in Block C. A place that needed repairs. That wasn't technically ready for occupancy. That would get me in trouble. Lieutenant Morrison called me to his office the next day. "Tanaka-san, you assigned Unit 47. It's not approved yet." "I know. The family needed help. There are procedures. There are children sleeping in train stations. I gave them walls. If that's wrong, then fire me." He stared, then smiled. "Thompson warned me you'd do this." Said you'd learn to bend rules for the right reasons. Will you reverse the assignment? No. But help me get the repairs done faster so it's officially ready. And next time, tell me first so I can help. Thank you. Thank you for caring more about people than paperwork. We need more of that. By the end of 1946, something remarkable was happening. Not just rebuilding, transformation. Japan was becoming something it had never been. Democratic, equal, modern, built on American ideals but with Japanese character. A hybrid emerging from occupation. Schools taught critical thinking instead of blind obedience. Women voted. Workers formed unions. The emperor remained but as a symbol, not a divine ruler. Power distributed instead of concentrated. It wasn't perfect. There was corruption, resistance, Americans who abused power, Japanese who resented occupation, growing pains of a nation being rebuilt from scratch, but it was working. Impossibly, against all historical precedent, it was working. In December, they held the first democratic elections. Women voting for the first time in Japanese history. 39 women elected to the Diet, more than any democracy in the world at that time. I voted, stood in line with my mother-in-law and hundreds of other women, cast a ballot, chose our leaders. I cried, from joy, from disbelief, from the impossible reality that a year ago I was a powerless widow, and now I had a voice in my country's future. Kenji asked me that night, "Mama, why are you crying?" Because today I did something my mother and grandmother never could. I chose. I had power. I made a difference. Like the Americans? Yes. Like the Americans taught us. Will they always be here? Good question. Would the occupation last forever? Would Americans eventually leave? What happened then? I don't know, I said honestly. But I think they taught us enough that we can do this ourselves. Eventually. When we're ready. Are we ready? Not yet. But we're learning. The years passed. 1947. 1948. 1949. The occupation continued but evolved. Less military control, more Japanese autonomy, partnership instead of domination. I was promoted. Regional Housing Coordinator. Overseeing programs across Yokohama. Working directly with American civil affairs officers and Japanese government officials. Kenji grew. Excelled in school. Spoke fluent English and Japanese. Played baseball and practiced kendo. A hybrid child of a hybrid nation. My mother-in-law passed away in 1948, peacefully. In her sleep, she'd lived to see Japan transformed. To see Kenji thriving. To see hope replace despair. At her funeral, I realized she'd forgiven. Completely forgiven the Americans for everything. Had died grateful for their help, instead of bitter about their bombs. Maybe that was the ultimate victory. Not military conquest, not political domination, but transforming enemies into friends through consistent kindness. In 1950, the Korean War started. American troops stationed in Japan were deployed. Suddenly, the occupiers became defenders. The dynamic shifted again. Japan became a strategic ally, a partner, a friend instead of a conquered enemy. Economic cooperation replaced military control. Trade instead of aid. Partnership instead of occupation. By 1951, they were negotiating the peace treaty, formal end to the occupation. Japan would become sovereign again. Independent, but allied. The transformation was complete. 5.5 years from total war to trusted ally. I attended the peace treaty signing in San Francisco as part of the Japanese delegation. Stood in that hall and watched our prime minister sign the document that restored our sovereignty. And I thought about those 4 soldiers. About a grave dug in my garden. About Thompson and his patience. About Morrison and his flexibility. About countless Americans who chose kindness over cruelty. They hadn't just defeated Japan. They'd helped us become something better. After the ceremony, an American reporter interviewed me. Asked about the occupation. Was it difficult? He asked. Being occupied by former enemies? I thought about how to answer. How to compress 6 years of transformation into a sentence. It was impossible, I said finally. Everything about it was impossible. But the impossible happened. We learned that enemies can become friends. That winning means helping, not punishing. That the cycle of revenge can be broken. The Americans taught us that, with shovels and rice and patience and respect. They showed us a different way. Do you forgive them? For the bombing? For your losses? I thought about Hiroshi, about everything taken from us. Forgiveness is complicated, I said, but I'm grateful for the help, for the kindness, for the chance to rebuild. Maybe that's better than forgiveness. Maybe that's hope. The article ran in newspapers across America. Japanese widow thanks occupiers for teaching hope. I got letters, hundreds of them, from American veterans who'd served in Japan, from families who'd lost sons, from people on both sides saying the same thing. Thank you for remembering the good. One letter was from Thompson, now a high school principal in Kansas, married with 3 children. Dear Akiko, I saw your interview. Made me cry. I'm not ashamed to admit. You remember those 4 soldiers who helped bury your husband? I was one of them. You knew that, but what you don't know is that day changed my life. I'd spent 2 years fighting, seeing death, becoming numb to it. Then we buried your husband and watched you cry, and suddenly he wasn't just an enemy casualty. He was a human being, a husband, a father, a person whose death mattered. It reminded me why we were fighting. Not just to defeat Japan. To save people like you and Kenji from systems that treated you as expendable. To build something better. Thank you for not hating us. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for helping us prove that the cycle can be broken. That enemies can become friends. That winning without mercy is just creating future wars. My students ask if the occupation was worth it. I show them your interview and say, read this. This is why. This is victory. With respect and friendship, John Thompson. I wrote back, told him about Kenji, about how he'd become a teacher like Thompson, about how he taught his students to question, to think, to never blindly follow, about how Hiroshi's last words lived on through his son. Thompson and I corresponded for years, until he died in 1987. At his funeral, his children read my letters aloud. Stories of occupation and rebuilding, proof that enemies had become friends. I lived to see miracles. Japan's economic boom, democracy strengthening, women's rights expanding. A nation transformed from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. I lived to see Kenji graduate university, become a teacher, marry, have children, give me grandchildren who never knew war or hunger or occupation. I lived to see Yokohama rebuilt, skyscrapers where ruins had been, prosperity where devastation had been, hope where despair had been. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, they held a memorial ceremony at Yokohama Harbor, Japanese and American veterans together, former enemies standing side by side, honoring the dead, celebrating the peace. I attended, 76 years old, one of the last witnesses to occupation, one of the last who remembered when Americans were enemies instead of allies. They asked me to speak, to share my story, to help the younger generation understand. I stood at that podium, looked at the crowd, Japanese and American faces, young and old, all connected by history they didn't always understand. In August 1945, I hated Americans, I said. They'd killed my husband, destroyed my city, taken everything. I wanted them to leave, to go away, to let us suffer alone. I paused, found my voice. But they didn't leave. They stayed. They helped. They showed kindness when cruelty would have been easier. They treated us like humans instead of defeated enemies. I saw people crying, veterans, widows, children of the war. 4 American soldiers buried my husband. They didn't have to. They could have walked past, could have treated him as just another dead enemy, but they dug his grave. They showed respect. They saw a grieving family and chose compassion. My voice broke. That choice, that single act of kindness from strangers, changed everything. It taught me that enemies can become friends, that hate can transform into trust, that winning means helping, not destroying. I held up the photograph. 4 soldiers, 1 grave, 50 years ago. These men are why Japan and America are allies today. Not because of treaties or politics or strategy, because they chose kindness, because they showed us a different way, because they proved the impossible was possible. The crowd stood, applauded, cried, Americans and Japanese together, honoring the dead, celebrating the friendship that rose from ruins. After the ceremony, a young American soldier approached me. Couldn't have been more than 20, stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for that speech, for helping me understand why we're still here, why the alliance matters. You're welcome. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you really forgive us? For everything?" I thought about it. Really thought. Did I forgive the bombs that killed Hiroshi? The war that took so much? "I don't know if I forgive," I said honestly, "but I'm grateful for the help, for the kindness, for the chance to rebuild, for the friendship that came from horror. Maybe that's better than forgiveness. Maybe that's hope." He nodded. "My grandfather fought in the Philippines. He said the same thing, that he didn't know if they forgave, but he was grateful they chose friendship instead of hate. Your grandfather was wise. He told me to serve with honor, to remember we're guests in your country, to treat people with respect. Then you honor his memory. I died in 2003, 84 years old, surrounded by family. Kenji held my hand. My grandchildren were there. Even 2 great-grandchildren I'd lived long enough to meet. The photograph, 4 soldiers, 1 grave, 1945, sat on my nightstand, still there after 58 years, still reminding me of the day the impossible became real. At my funeral, Kenji spoke. My mother lived through hell, lost her husband, lost her home, lost everything, but she never lost hope, because 4 American soldiers showed her kindness when hatred would have been easier. He held up the photograph. These men transformed my mother's life, transformed Japan, transformed history. They didn't just defeat an enemy, they created a friend. They proved that the cycle of revenge can be broken, that winning means helping, that kindness is stronger than hate. He paused, voice thick with emotion. My mother taught me to question, to think, to never blindly follow. Those were my father's last words, and she honored them her entire life. She questioned the propaganda that led to war. She questioned the hate that should have followed occupation. She questioned whether enemies had to stay enemies, and she found answers. In a grave dug by strangers, in rice given freely, in respect shown to the defeated, in friendship offered without conditions. She lived to see Japan and America become allies, partners, friends, and she said that was the real victory, not military, not economic, but moral, the victory of choosing to break the cycle, to build instead of destroy, to help instead of punish. That's her legacy. Not hate, not bitterness, but hope. Impossible, absurd, beautiful hope. The photograph hangs in Kenji's home now. His children know the story. His grandchildren know it too. 4 American soldiers digging a grave in a ruined garden. The moment everything changed, because some stories are worth keeping. Some lessons are worth teaching. Some memories refuse to fade. I was Akiko Tanaka, a widow who survived, a woman who learned that enemies can become friends, a mother who taught her son to question everything and believe in the impossible. But mostly, I was someone who received kindness from strangers and spent the rest of her life proving that kindness matters, that mercy is stronger than revenge, that the cycle can be broken. 4 soldiers made that choice in my garden, and that choice rippled through 70 years, through a rebuilt nation, through an alliance that still endures, through friendship that replaced hate. They didn't just bury my husband. They planted hope. And that hope grew into something neither side could have imagined on that day, in August 1945. That's the lesson I learned. That's what I taught. That's what I pass on. Choose kindness, even to enemies, especially to enemies, because kindness transforms, because mercy creates allies, because the impossible becomes possible when humans remember to be human. 4 soldiers remembered, and the world changed. This story matters because it shows that how we treat our defeated enemies defines who we are. That victory without mercy just creates future wars. That kindness is the ultimate weapon. Akiko Tanaka lived this truth for 58 years after 4 strangers dug a grave in her garden. Now her story lives through us, If this moved you, if this changed how you think about enemies and forgiveness and hope, then hit that subscribe button, smash the like. And in the comments, tell me, who showed you unexpected kindness when you needed it most? Share that story. Let's remember together that we're all human, that mercy matters, that the cycle can be broken. See you in the next one.